I mean, as you've noticed, I'm going to give a kind of old school humanities talk. I'm going to just read to you. Well, I won't just read to you, but I'll speak to you without slides or a handout. But the good news is that I've decided to keep things at a very broad schematic level. I'm trying to zoom out and sort of get an overview of the landscape of some of these topics. So I don't think there's anything very technical that you would need slides. I mean, they would seem out of place for this. I wanted to mention also one of the things that I thought was most interesting that came out of the conversations yesterday is how differently we understand what it is for something to be implicit, or how many things it can mean for something to be implicit. And I realized I was using it or thinking of it in a way that's somewhat different from the description in the conference and from many other people. I'm using it in a very broad sense. I think in English it's perfectly idiomatic to say something like, we have an implicit agreement in my family, no politics at holidays, right? Where this doesn't mean it's buried deep or hard to, I mean, anybody could articulate it at any moment, they just don't. It's unspoken, and that's all implicit means in that context. But I think it can mean anything from that to things that are pre-conscious or unconscious in the sense we talked about, things that can't be articulated or that are very difficult to articulate. And I think perhaps I'm going to be speaking to all of these, but just to forestall confusion, I just wanted to say at the outset that I have this very broad understanding of implicit. So okay, that's the general sort of stuff I wanted to say to give context. What I'm going to do in the talk today is try to apply some work. I decided to take the occasion of this amazing topic to really think about implicit motives and flourishing, which is something I hadn't given a lot of attention to, but intersects, I think, with a lot of issues that I have been thinking about and giving attention to for a lot of years. And so this is, in this sense, work in progress. I'm trying to think about the intersection of these two ideas. And I work on personal identity mostly, and I started in on this topic by thinking about flourishing and how, you know, the many different notions of flourishing there are and how hard it is to say what constitutes flourishing. But one thing I did notice, and this is something that Godehard pointed out in the wonderful overview, which was so helpful at the very beginning yesterday, is that many conceptions of flourishing connect it to authenticity and self-expression. The idea that to live a flourishing human life, you somehow have to, in the way you live, express who you are and live authentically. And there are many views that do this, and they can be very, very different because they contain very different views of what the self is and what it means to express it, and that comes out very differently. So my plan for the talk today, as I say, is mostly to get a sense of the landscape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at, I think, three representative or three very common types, broad types of views that connect self and flourishing, that are very different in their conceptions of self and flourishing. And I'm going to talk about them in very general terms, and they're very heterogeneous groups within themselves, but I'm going to paint in broad strokes. And for each, I'll give at least one example of a view, and I'll take an extreme one to really represent the kind of thing I'm talking about. Then I'm going to offer an alternative view or another entry into this sort of space of discussion that picks and chooses bits from the other one. So I'm going to talk about three different views first before I give my own. The first and the third of these are all about, I mean, the second one has a lot of space for implicit motives and elements. The first and third, not so much. The first and second see the self as necessarily a strongly unified or consistent entity. The third one, not so much. And I'm going to try to cobble together something that allows for a little bit of inconsistency in the self and also brings in the implicit features that are in the second one. This is all very schematic, but you'll see as I go along. I promise it won't be so mysterious. I wish that what I was doing was saying, here are three views, each of which has something right but a deadly flaw. Here is the fourth one, which fixes all the deadly flaws and captures what's right. I don't think flourishing or self is as simple as that. So despite my ponderous title, my aim is just the fairly modest one of trying to scope out the space of possibilities and maybe give a new way of looking at things that can perhaps be fruitful going forward. So the first of the three existing, I wanted to give them pithy names, but I couldn't come. This is the only one I've been able to name. But the first conception that I want to look at of self and flourishing, I'm going to call the self-constitution view, and it basically holds that we constitute ourselves, make ourselves selves, human selves in this important sense, through our choices and commitments. And so the basic picture is that, like many other animals, most other animals, we experience a messy set of pulls and motivations and drives, often connected to our immediate circumstances. But we humans, and maybe some other animals, this is an open question, have the ability to step back from our immediate drives and to consider which of them we wish to act on, what kind of life we want to lead, how we want to conduct ourselves in our lives as a whole. And this allows us to make choices about which drives and impulses to nurture and which to reject, to commit ourselves to a set of values or guiding principles. And in this way, according to the self-constitution approach, we develop a unified will or self, and this approach tends to identify the self with the will. Basically, it's the phrase that we also had at the very beginning before, "You are what you do," is sort of the motto of this approach. Who you are is what you choose, where choose often has a very strong meaning here. So there are many examples of this kind of understanding of the self throughout history. We had some really nice panoramic views of going back to Plato, but I'm going to pick two fairly recent instances as my examples because they're very useful for my purposes. And that's the work, because they are extreme in this sort of way, the work of Christine Korsgaard and Harry Frankfurt, each of whom argues in a somewhat different way that we constitute ourselves through selective commitment to some motivations or principles of action over others. So Frankfurt, for instance, explains that when someone wholeheartedly decides to act upon one rather than the other of two conflicting desires, in his words, the decision determines what the person really wants by making the desire on which he acts fully his own. To this extent, he says, the person, in making a decision by which he identifies with a desire, constitutes himself. And he adds further that our acts of ordering and rejection, integration and separation of desires creates a self out of the raw materials of an inner life. Now, if we fail, the connection to flourishing is that if we fail to construct an identity in this way, we fail to be who and what we are, according to this view. We are, in Harry Frankfurt's evocative term, wantons rather than true persons. Now, both Frankfurt and Korsgaard say that our commitments in order to constitute a self have to be completely wholehearted. If we identify with two or more conflicting desires, we've just failed to take a stand, and so to constitute a fact about where we stand with respect to this conflict. So on this view, ambivalence paralyzes us. It prevents us from being able to truly act as agents at all. And if we act in opposition to our wholehearted commitments, if we are able to make a commitment but then somehow can't follow through on it, we saw examples of that before, right? This is the kind of alienation we were talking about, right? When we're weak of will, for instance. Then, according to this view, we have damaged ourselves in deep and fundamental ways. So Frankfurt tells us that betraying ourselves by acting against our commitments causes drastic psychic injuries of a sort we're naturally averse to inflicting on ourselves. And Korsgaard, in even stronger terms, points out that our commitments often demand great sacrifices of us, and sometimes they'll demand even that we risk our lives. And she asks, why would we do this? I mean, she's trying to find the normative source of our commitments. Why would we risk our lives for a commitment? Why not just give up the commitment? And she says that the reason is because for most human beings, on most occasions, these are her words, the only thing that could be as bad or worse than death is something that for us amounts to death, not being ourselves anymore. And she says, and when we violate these fundamental commitments and undermine our agency, that's exactly what we do. So according to this approach, Flourishing involves conscious, reflective self-direction. A flourishing life is one in which we successfully carve out a consistent and unified set of self-defining principles, and we shape our lives accordingly. Now, at the other end of at least some spectrum, there are so many spectra you could come up with here, is a view according to which we have a deep or innate pre-given self, not one we choose, but one that we have to discover and express if we're going to flourish. And there are really, really a lot of variations on this general approach, but because it is in some important respects as far from Korsgaard and Frankfurt as possible, and because it intersects with the themes of the conference, and I guess to show my American pride or something, I'm going to look at this approach as it appears in the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, which I think is deeply underappreciated. So Emerson's work, like that of all the figures I will discuss today, Korsgaard, Frankfurt, everyone, is far more complicated, obviously, than I can do justice to, so I'm just going to give a very rough overview. So Emerson says that each of us is imbued by nature with a genius, which is a unique creative voice that's ours to express in our lives. And the source of this genius, he says, is what we call spontaneity or instinct. And he says that the primary wisdom, the one that gives us access to our genius, is called intuition, which is a big word for him. And the only way we can access our genius and fulfill our true natures on this view is through spontaneity and receptivity, and not through reflection and exercise of the will. To the contrary, attempts to will what we are will only interfere, he says, with the action of our spontaneity and instinct, and get in the way of allowing us to recognize and realize our genius. So it might sound, he says, we have to just get out of our own way, and this might sound all new agey and very easy to do, but on Emerson's view, getting out of your own way is no easy undertaking, and allowing your true self to come out is no easy undertaking. And the reasons are the same reasons that give support to the self-constitution approach. He allows that we naturally crave consistency and coherence in our attitudes and our principles of action, and that we wish not only to be ourselves, but to understand ourselves. We want to be able to articulate the principles according to which we're acting and the reasons for what we're doing. But since our genius, on his view, represents a truly original and creative power, if we allow it to show through, we aren't always going to be able to do that. What intuition or instinct tells us is true or right at the moment, he says, may be inconsistent with what we had previously thought, and the principles, motives, and purposes of our genius and in its intuitive renderings to us right now may not be intelligible to us. We just know that we feel it in our heart to be true, but we don't know why. So to express our true natures, we have to resist, he says, the strong impulse to be understood by others and even to understand ourselves, and this takes a lot of courage. So he tells us, for instance, that he'll shun father and mother and wife and brother when his genius calls him, and that he would write on the lintels of his doorpost whim, adding that he hopes that it's somewhat better than whim at last, but we cannot spend the day in explanation. So this goes back to the idea that when I act on whim, I'm not really acting from reasons. He's saying, well, I don't know if it's whim or not, I just have to believe it. And there's also this great exchange going back, I think you were talking about Ignatius saying, how do you know the voices you listen to are your true voices? And he says he has an exchange with a preacher who says, how do you know that the voices you hear don't come from the devil? And he says, well, if they come from the devil, then I guess I'm the devil's child, and that's just who I have to be. I can't answer any other law but the law of my own nature. So obedience to our genius thus demands, although he clearly doesn't think he's the devil's child, his point is, who are you, right? I have to listen to my instinct. So obedience to our genius demands self-trust. Trust thyself, he says. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. And we can be frightened from self-trust by our desire to be intelligible to others, and by a foolish consistency, which he famously describes as the hobgoblin of little minds. If we give in to the pressure to be comprehensible and consistent, according to him, we fail to express our genius and end up living lives of conformity and imitation. And sort of echoing Korsgaard, he says, imitation is death. We come to learn. Or we live lives of what his friend Henry David Thoreau describes as quiet desperation. But if we have the strength of self-trust, he points out, and I think this is important for where I'm going with this, a deeper kind of unity and consistency, a kind of inchoate one, will emerge. So he says, he doesn't give up on the idea that we're consistent. What he says is, there will be an agreement in whatever variety of actions, so they be each honest and natural in their hour. For of one will the actions will be harmonious, however unlike they seem. These varieties are lost sight of at a little distance. At a little height of thought, one tendency unites them all. The voyage of the best ship is a zigzag line of 100 tacks. See the line from a sufficient distance, and it straightens itself to the average tendency. Your genuine action will explain itself and will explain your other genuine actions. So roughly, self-expression and flourishing require obedience, which is a word he uses a lot, to one's instinct, and a willingness to be superficially inconsistent in the service of a deeper unity. So before moving on, obviously there are a lot of metaphysical commitments in Emerson that not everyone's going to go along with, and that's part of the point. But I want to note three things before I look at the third account and then try to pull things together in a fourth. First, while both the self-constitution and Emersonian approaches are presented in very strong and extreme terms, it's not entirely obvious that they don't actually make room for some of what the other wants to give. Proponents of the self-constitution approach often seem to be implying that every conflict must be resolved, every conflicting pull of desires has to be resolved through self-conscious reflection, but that's hardly a viable way to live a life, and they certainly know that. And they do sometimes seem to allow that some of this work can be done sort of automatically, but they don't really work out how that happens and when you can do that. Some people like Michael Bratman maybe try to give an account, but it's not clear. So if they do make room for a sort of automatic reaction to the world, they don't explain how that works. And while Emerson rails against reflecting on how one should live one's life, it's not evident that he means there's never a place for self-conscious reflection, because after all, he's writing all these essays, which are in some sense reflections on how one ought to live one's life. So there's room, I think, for these to accommodate each other, but they just don't explain how that would work. Second point that I want to make, and in connection with the themes of the workshop, I just want to highlight the fact that the Emersonian picture of flourishing relies heavily on the expression of what's implicit, at least in some sense of implicit, including motives and a lot of other things. So the true self for him is not something immediately known, and it's also, in a pretty strong sense, not something that I can articulate, right? It's something occult or inchoate that provides intimations of the motives and principles that guide it, this one will that he talks about. And it gives these intimations through intuition, but it's not something that I can explain to you, or myself. And finally, I want to emphasize that although the source of unity is very different for these two views, they are, as I mentioned at the outset, they each have it as a critical element that there is a unified self, whether created or discovered, and that it's this expression of this deeply unified self that has to be expressed if one is to flourish. And on the surface, that's pretty plausible, right? Because if flourishing requires self-expression, there has to be a self to be expressed. And the question is, right, how do you have a proper self? If there isn't some kind of consistency and integrity of principle, what else would it mean? But the final view I will look at challenges the idea that you need some kind of strong unity or consistency, whether, right, deeply hidden or on the surface or self-created. And that's the view of Galen Strawson. So Strawson's view is like Emerson's in that it supports spontaneity and liberation from the demands of consistency, But unlike Emerson's, it doesn't suggest that this is in the service of expressing some deep unity that's beyond our ken or anything like that, which lies beneath this apparent discontinuity. Instead, he suggests that some of us, at least, just have a lot of variability and inconsistency in our lives, and that expressing that is expressing ourselves. So this also relies on some metaphysics, which I'll do quickly. Strawson makes some metaphysics that depends on phenomenology. So Strawson makes a distinction between one's experience of oneself when one is considering oneself principally as a human being taken as a whole, so, a person existing over time, and one's experience of oneself when one is considering oneself principally as an inner mental entity or self of some sort. So for him, the self is the conscious subject of experience. And to illustrate this difference, he provides an example of Henry James claiming that he thinks one of his earlier works was he thinks of it as the work of quite another person than myself. He says maybe a close friend or distant cousin, but it doesn't feel like his work at all. I think we all know this kind of experience. Now, obviously, James is aware that he is the human being who authored this earlier work. He collects the royalties and goes to the book signings or whatever James does. But he is, in Strawson's terms, a different self, right? He has to imaginatively reconstruct what it would be like to be that person. He doesn't feel any deep identification as a self. So to disambiguate pronouns that might apply either to human lives or selves, Strawson adopts the convention of starring pronouns that apply to the self. So I star, me star talk about these selves, right? What James is in the present that's different from in the past. I and me are ambiguous. So Strawson's claim is that a single human life may, and many do, contain very many successive human selves. Some people, he calls them diachronics, may experience themselves as enduring and consistent over time, but others, whom he calls episodics, experience themselves as of relatively short duration, and their life is just made up of a succession of them. In diachronic self-experience, he says, one naturally figures oneself considered as a self as something that was there in the further past or will be there in the further future, while in episodic self-experience, one doesn't consider oneself as a self, something that was there in the past or is likely to be there in the future. So he says he is an episodic. He doesn't, he says, have a great deal of concern for his future or think very much at all about his past. And he claims Montaigne, the Earl of Shaftesbury, Virginia Woolf, Sartre, and many others as episodics who just, sort of live in the moment and don't really think about the structure of their whole life or care about it very much. For episodics, ideals of consistency and coherence over a lifetime are enemies, he says, of self-expression or flourishing. He says they can close down important avenues of thought, impoverish our grasp of ethical possibilities, needlessly and wrongly distress those who don't fit the model, and are potentially destructive in psychotherapeutic contexts. Perhaps you can speak to that. This is in contrast, he says, to the kind of joyful ease that's possible for the episodic. Some, he says, may think that an episodic life must be deprived in some way, but truly happy-go-lucky, see-what-comes-along lives are among the best there are, vivid, blessed, profound. So for the episodic, at least, flourishing involves expressing who he star is at each moment without worrying about any kind of unity over life. Now, there are lots of questions and challenges to raise about Strawson's view, and I'm going to do that in just a moment. But before talking about the difficulties, I want to point to two features of the view that are fairly unusual, at least in contemporary analytic philosophical discussion of these things, and that I think need to be taken seriously and explored further. So the first is the idea that there can be just a lot of personal variation with respect to self and self-experience, and so different routes to flourishing. We tend to talk about in philosophy, what constitutes the self, and he's just saying maybe that constitutes your self, mine is different, and I think we have to take that seriously because it does seem to be true, right? Second is the idea that not all selves are deeply unified, that some human lives, or the way he would put it, some human lives don't contain unified selves over time, but actually have many different selves of relatively short duration. So what I want to do in the remainder of my time is to outline this fourth picture that I want to develop, which is a picture of self and flourishing that does contain these two features, making room for human variation and for, lots of, people who have sort of less unified lives. But my view is going to, in my view, each of these features is going to be very different. There are many fundamental differences I have from Strawson. So to get into this view, what I'm going to do is begin by looking at a serious challenge for the Strawsonian view that has been raised by many people. And Strawson gives a response, which I will describe. I don't think it works, but I think it contains the seeds of the kind of view that I want to try to develop quickly, or describe quickly. I don't have time to develop it. So the presupposition, so Strawson says life doesn't have to be deeply unified, but of course the presupposition that we must have a deep unity in our life of some sort to flourish isn't unmotivated in the views that say that we must have such a unity. It's based on the thought that a life that isn't unified at its core couldn't contain the depth and coherence necessary for human flourishing. A truly episodic life, it would be argued, in which one just is who one is at every moment without regard to the past or future, would be at best chaotic, disorganized, and shallow, and you're likely to do a lot of imprudent things in such a life, the argument would go. And really the main argument is that it's not clear how such a life could include things like the long-term plans and projects and relationships with other people that not only characterize human lives, but seem to be the things that give it a lot of its meaning and importance to us, right? Many of the elements that are most generally taken to be most important on flourishing are things that unfold over time and require commitment and consistency and work. So Korsgaard puts it this way in her response to Derek Parfit's view of personal identity, which also has this character. She says, suppose that a succession of rational agents do occupy my body. I, the one who exists now, need the cooperation of the others, and they need mine if together we're going to have any kind of a life. And Kathleen Wilkes raises this objection, or one like it, directly against Strawson, speaking particularly of what she sees as the moral shallowness that would necessarily be part of an episodic life. Planning future action, she says, calculating consequences, experiencing remorse and contrition, accepting responsibility, accepting praise and blame, emotions such as love or hate or envy or resentment, all require that we have a life or self with duration, she says. We are and must consider ourselves as relatively stable intentional systems, essentially full stop, right? So there's no room for episodic experience. Now, this certainly seems like a legitimate worry. If we take Strawson at his word, it is difficult to see why an episodic life wouldn't make long-term activities or relationships impossible. And we have all kinds of characters from life and literature who are dilettantish in this way, and they're Good Time Charlie who's depressed always at the end of the day. And Strawson seems to recognize its force, and he offers the following reply to Wilkes's objection. He says there's no reason an episodic can't do everything Wilkes mentions, and presumably anything else that we might think is necessary, because any of the ethical practices or moral emotions that she describes is perfectly available to an episodic, so long as that episodic recognizes that there are certain rights or responsibilities that come with being in a particular human history. So he says he star knows that he's in the human history of Galen Strawson, and this means that he star will be expected to keep the promises made by the selves earlier in that human history, and to consider in a special way the well-being of selves will come later, take praise and blame for their actions, pay their mortgage, whatever, right? he says, he bear a certain relationship to those who have done them good deeds in the past or who reared the earlier selves or whatever it is. So I take it, I find this sort of hard to wrap my head around, but I think he must mean that it's like being a Kennedy or a Capulet or something, right? You find yourself in a human history and there are certain, you have to hate Montagues, but you get to inherit this nice castle or whatever it is. And I think he says, okay, I'm in the human life of Marya Schechtman, and so I, have to sort of get with the program of Marya Schechtman, whatever her star was in the past, or she star was in the past, and, think about the posterity and so on. So he says that in addition to being himself star, he recognizes that he is also Galen Strawson, or as he puts it, GS, the continuing person and human being, and that others know this, and he recognizes that for others he is fundamentally GS, the continuing human being. And for this reason, he says, there's a straightforward respect in which that's how he primarily figures himself when he's engaged with others. So in a moment, I'm going to question whether this works, but it's a strange response even within Strawson's own system, I think, because if the episodic is going to do and feel what Wilkes says he cannot, according to the response that Strawson has given, his he star will have to do it by self-consciously and reflectively imposing unity and order, by saying, oh, I star am in this life and I'm in this human history and it requires me to do certain things and so on. So in other words, episodic who's going to be able to do these things and respond to this objection won't be able to just be who he is at the moment. He's going to have to constrain his present self to make it consistent with the past and think about the future, and he's going to have to do it in a way that seems more alienating than on the self-constitution view. Now, I think maybe I'm misreading Strawson here. Maybe he's just saying, look, if you care about those things, you could do them as an episodic, but actually I think it's better not to do them. And sometimes he does have this sort of, Western Zen, look, guilt is bad, and this helps free you from these negative emotions that don't serve you. But if he goes that direction, then he has failed to explain how you get the coherence that you need that he was trying to give in the first place. So I find it a puzzling answer for him to give anyway. But I think there are good reasons anyway to wonder whether this strategy could really support the kind of moral emotions and capacities and practices that Wilkes says the episodic can't engage in, right? Because what he's saying is something like this: I star know that some self in my human history married this guy, and I know that there are certain expectations if you're in the human history where one of yourselves married someone, so I guess, right, I have these obligations now. Or some other self star had this child, I guess it's mine to raise. I mean, I suppose someone could do that, but it doesn't seem like the standard way of having a fulfilling and meaningful long-term relationship. Or, right, think about the other things that give our lives meaning, like a philosophical project. So it turns out that some self in my history accepted an invitation to be here, and then some other one wrote this thing, and now I star have to deliver it to you and defend it in the question period if I leave time for questions. This one could do it, but it certainly doesn't seem like the kind of philosophical project that gives meaning to your life by working it out. So, I don't see that Strawson has a very convincing answer to the question of why an episodic life wouldn't be shallow. Emerson has an answer to this worry, even though he says, do what seems right now, because he has this strong presupposition of a pre-existing unified self that will express itself if you let it. But, right, that requires us, as I mentioned before, to buy into his transcendentalist metaphysics, which some people will, but a lot of people won't. I suspect a lot of people in this room won't. So the question that I put to myself is whether there's a way to avoid chaos or shallowness, but allow a little bit of flexibility in a life without having to commit yourself to a pre-existing strong unity of the sort that Emerson describes. And I think we have a clue as to how we might do this in Strawson's response if we just rethink it a little bit. So what Strawson emphasizes is the fact that each of us is whatever else we are, in some sense a single human being living a single human life, and that human lives and human organisms or human beings or human animals, whatever you want to call them, are salient units of interpersonal interaction and activity. Others see him as the continuing person, GS. And he's not the only one to point this out, right? That's a key part of Korsgaard's reply to Parfit. Hey, I'm in this body living this human life, so even if I am a lot of rational agents, they better coordinate, because in interacting with the world, this whole thing is taken as a unit. So what I see as a problem in both Strawson and Korsgaard is that they seem to present this fact about our living a single human life and its being salient as something we just know intellectually. There's semantic knowledge of the fact that I'm living a human life and this is going to be seen and treated as a salient unit, and so coordination is going to be expected over the course of a life by the powers outside me, by social powers. So what they seem to say is, okay, I know I've got a single human life. As it happens, at each moment I'm experiencing these drives and motivations that might be at odds with other parts of this life, so I have to step back and, use my big mind to put it together if you're Korsgaard, or if you're Strawson, give up on it and let it go, or if you want to, you can put it together or whatever. But that seems to be the picture they have. There's this bit of intellectual knowledge about the whole, and then there's the experience on the ground at the moment of the drives and pulls of the moment. But it seems to me that this is the wrong way to think about it, right? When I criticize Strawson's response to Wilkes, the examples I gave of finding that you're married to someone because of the previous self, or that you're working on this project, were meant to demonstrate the weakness and the implausibility of the idea that our relation to our whole human life is an intellectual recognition that I have a past and a future, and that I know some facts about the past and the future. Right? It's clearly an important fact about humans that we're able to reflect on the fact that we're continuing human beings and to think about the shape of our lives as a whole. But it's deeply questionable, maybe only a philosopher would have to say this, whether this is the only or even the primary way in which we're aware of the wholeness of our lives. And our lives would be very different if it were. Both Strawson and Korsgaard point out that others see and treat us as single human beings from roughly cradle to grave, and Strawson also makes the fairly obvious point that this isn't an arbitrary fact, right? There are undoubtedly very good evolutionary reasons why we see our conspecifics and ourselves in this way. And it's something that is inscribed in all of our social institutions, and therefore something that we're socialized into from the very beginning of our lives that gets reinforced in multiple ways on a daily basis. So when I think of my trip here, for instance, right, just the invitation is based on work I did earlier, the passport is what gets me on my plane, I have to know my birth date, right, the seat on the plane is assigned because the earlier human did it, right, there was a sign when I got off the plane, right, telling me that Marya Schechtman was supposed to go here. Every day, the fact that I am connected to this past, this human past, and this human future, right, I hear about the stipend I'm going to get, all of these things, right, are reinforced just all the time, all the ways. And so I think as a result, we internalize this understanding of ourselves and come to see, treat, and experience ourselves as single beings throughout our human lives in something like the automatic and unreflective way we do this with others, which means that we have an immediate and direct experience of ourselves as continuing beings living a single human life, which we can become explicitly aware of. But we don't just become, I mean, before we're explicitly aware of it, or at times when we're not, it's always there in the background. And it's not just in the background that we exist over time, I don't think, but what we've internalized is this idea that we have a life with a broadly predictable trajectory insofar as, we're embodied, we start as dependent children, we mature, if we're lucky, we age, right? We eventually die, we know this. and that this is, but we don't just know it. We have it going in the background all the time. And there are cultural benchmarks which, whether we accept them or not, or we think they're good or not, we know what they are. We know where we are roughly on the journey. We know what's expected of us at this time. We know what likely is behind us. We know what likely is in front of us. And I keep using the word know, and I wasn't going to do that, but I did. But I want to say it's not just knowledge. I walk around with a background awareness. I mean, I certainly could make this explicit if I wanted to. I'm doing it now. But there's a background awareness. I mean, not just that I'm living a finite life with a particular shape, but that I'm at a certain point in it, right? Some things are behind me. Some things are in front of me. I know I'm not going to be going to college, right? I already did that, right? But there are other things that I hope are still in front of me, and so on. So I'm trying to go quickly, so now I have to figure out where we are. So we, I think, have all of this going on, but what Strawson is right about, and what's also right in the other views that I talked about, is that, of course, we also have strong and compelling temporally local pulls and preoccupations that cannot have much to do with the details of the past and future in a lot of ways. How I am right now can involve a very different set of drives and characteristics and motivations than I've had in the past, than I can anticipate having in the future, but also, I say, than I have from the extended perspective. And so this is really the point I was trying to make when I kept using the word know and didn't mean to, is that we have temporally local perspectives with drives and pulls and motivations and so on that need to be coordinated over time. But we also have a perspective of ourselves as extended wholes that is a phenomenological thing that's part of our self-experience all the time that doesn't require us to step back from the moment, right? It's not like I have, desires to eat the chocolate cake at the moment, but in the future I have a desire not to be overweight or ill or whatever, and now I have to figure out why my present self should do something for my future self, which is how philosophers often put it. I right now have a bunch of motivations that come from my experience of myself as an extended being, like I want to live a long, healthy life. That's just a diachronic motivation. It's not made up of little, I want it to be good at this time and good at this time and good at this time and good at this time. I want to have a good life. And we have motivations that are from the perspective of the whole human being. So since it looks like we're running out of time, let me just quickly say what I think this means and what it has to do with flourishing. I have a really nice quote that I won't use here from Middlemarch, but I can do it in the question period if people are interested. So the point that I want to make then is that as a matter of phenomenology, our experience of self, I think, and I think this is a sort of general point, is multi-perspectival, right? We aren't just in the present and then we have to step back and look at the future. We have what we're preoccupied with in the moment, and we have, episodic memory of the past, and we also have this perspective of the extended whole all the time. And so, well, maybe, do I have 5 minutes? Oh, okay, then I will read you the Middlemarch quote, because I think that it's my favorite quote for this and really sums it up nicely. And then I'll just tell you what this has to do with implicit motivations, and I'll stop. So in Middlemarch, Dr. Lydgate is a serious scholar and doctor and a very responsible man, but we learn that he had an earlier infatuation with an actress, a scandalous one who possibly murdered. It was all bad. And here's how Lydgate's state of mind is described. He knew that this was like the sudden impulse of a madman, incongruous with his habitual foibles. No matter. It was the one thing which he was resolved to do. He had two selves within him, apparently, and they must learn to accommodate each other and bear reciprocal impediments. Strange that some of us with quick alternate visions see beyond our infatuations, and even while we rave on the heights, behold the wide plain where our persistent self pauses and awaits us. So the point I want to make is this is all part of Lydgate's experience. he doesn't know that this is incongruous. Well, he does know, but the metaphor that's used is perceptual. He sees his future self. He sees the broad plane. He's raving on the heights. He sees that he has two selves within him. And so what I want to say is what this means is not that he has, split experience or split streams of consciousness, but simply that the nature and quality of his experience of his love for the actress is of, among other things, something that's temporary, something that's passing, something that's incongruent. All of that is sort of built into the quality of the experience so that the different perspectives are all part of what he's feeling at each moment. So what does any of this have to do with the other people I talked about or implicit motivations? The idea that I want to develop is just roughly this, that the type of implicitness that is relevant here is that we can't be keeping track, and I think it goes back to Professor Cole's talk about how, right, there's just too much cognitive load or something, right? We can't be keeping track of how all the pieces of our lives fit together. We can't be reflecting on that. It's too complicated, it's too much. We can't interact with the world in that way. And yet, because we have these different perspectives, because the extended perspective is always there with the multiple perspectives of the time, we're always engaged in negotiations and bearing reciprocal impediments and trying to put it together. And this is work I think goes on in the background. Some of it can be made explicit, some of it not. I think it allows for human variability because the picture of flourishing I would try to develop is one where this negotiation is going on relatively smoothly in the background and doesn't intrude so that we have to bring in reflective consciousness and try to sort it out. But what that negotiation will look like may be very different for different people. Some people, Korsgaard may need a lot of unity, Strawson may not. The Emersonian picture, just the very last thing, the Emersonian piece of this is, I think, and because of this, one of the things that we have to do to lead a flourishing life is to have a certain amount of self-trust that this negotiation is going on, that the bit I'm not expressing right now is somehow going to find its way back in, just like when you have to cut the bit you love from a paper, but you just trust that when you write the next paper or at some future point, it will find its way back if you really love it. And you have to trust sometimes that the extended perspective is doing its moderating work and keeping you from really running off with the actress or whatever. So I can say more about this, but I want to leave some time, so thank you very much.